I'd like to start this morning by reading aloud a very important text, perhaps the most important text to the people of this congregation. This text comprises our congregational covenant. This covenant contains a set of solemn promises that each of us as members of this church have already made one to another. It goes like this. As members of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Jacksonville, in order to nurture and enhance our lives together in this sacred space where we seek personal growth, discern life's meaning, and build relationships of fairness and love, we intend to offer our unique gifts, talents, time, energy, and financial support. Respect the views and needs of others, practicing tolerance, understanding, and acceptance, even in disagreement, allowing loving relationships to transcend issues. Celebrate the diversity within our midst, even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. Invite and welcome others in the quest for spiritual and ethical growth, recognizing each other and guests in fellowship, and share the ministry of our church, caring for each other through times of joy and sorrow. It's a beautiful and poetic covenant. For this morning, I'd like to focus our collective attention on the third element of this covenant, the promise to celebrate the diversity within our midst, even when it is difficult or uncomfortable. Anyone who says that being a member of UUCJ is easy has never really thought about this promise, what it truly means, what it truly requires from each and every one of us. Notice that there is no qualifier, there is no limiter in front of the word diversity. Meaning we at this church, we've got to celebrate all kinds of diversity, not just the sexy kinds. Like racial diversity. We UUs love the idea of racial diversity. Not that most UU churches right now have that much of it. We are still, frankly, primarily a white denomination, but we're getting there. That's a whole sermon unto itself, though. We UUs, we also love sexual orientation diversity, and honestly, we deserve to pat ourselves on the back there. We have done a pretty good job of celebrating the diversity brought to our congregations by people who self-identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer. We've done a good job there. But what of other kinds of diversity? Are we committed to celebrating socioeconomic diversity? Are we a church where people who use food stamps feel welcomed and comfortable every Sunday? What about political diversity? We UUs are proud to be religious liberals, but religious liberalism is not synonymous with political liberalism. So are we a church where political conservatives feel welcomed to worship? Are we a church where Republicans and libertarians would still feel welcome to attend after engaging in a frank political conversation downstairs after social hour? I think that knowing laugh tells us a lot. And it could. It could and it should. What about theological diversity? Truth be told, this is the kind of diversity that I want to focus on this morning. No doubt, we have theological diversity here in this congregation. I know for a fact, here at UUCJ, we have among us Christians, Buddhists, Muslims, pagans, humanists, atheists, and agnostics. So it's not a question of whether we have theological diversity within our congregation, but the question is, do we celebrate it? See, I think there's a difference between celebrating and tolerating. Tolerating diversity suggests, frankly, ignoring the diversity. If a society merely tolerates racial diversity, for example, it suggests that that society doesn't really consider race important. It ignores the immense impact race has on individual identity. It ignores the unique beauty, both physical and cultural, that is to be found among the different races. So where are UUs today in 2014 when it comes to celebrating theological diversity here within our congregations? I fear that by and large, UU congregations tend to tolerate theological diversity rather than celebrate it. We tend to ignore and overlook individual theological differences rather than recognize and celebrate them. Thus, we gravitate towards our lowest common denominator, the things that we can all agree upon at all times. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with celebrating those things that we can all agree upon. After all, we are a religion without creed. So we have no set of beliefs to rally around. So it is important for us to focus on those things that we all share in common. Absolutely. But I would suggest that we would be fools if we wanted to live there permanently. And that is because there is not enough real estate there to support us. The number of ideas that we all really, truly agree upon are actually quite limited, more limited than most of us are comfortable admitting. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote, "If two people think exactly alike, then one of them's not thinking." We are a congregation of over 270 members. We are not like-minded. Nor do we want to be if we are sincere and honest in the value that we place on diversity. Unanimity and uniformity are enemies of the free church. We would do best to be wary of the concept of perpetual harmony. It is fool's gold. It will not lead us to growth or new creation. Real people living in authentic relationships with other real people have disagreements and differences of opinion. An example, my wife, Sunny, right over there, we have been married for nearly 13 years. And I'm going to tell you all a little secret. One time, we had a difference of opinion. Shh. Oh, and that difference of opinion, it led to an argument. Yep. All right, so actually it was more than one time. Honestly, I've had more arguments with Sunny than any other human being on earth. How is that possible? Is it that I don't love her? It's precisely the opposite. It's because I love her and that she loves me. It's because I love her more than any other human being on earth that we can be real with each other, sharing our full, true selves, being vulnerable with one another, trusting one another. Conflict and disagreement are not dirty words. They are not things to be avoided at all costs. It was through those conflicts that Sunny and I both grew as individuals, as a couple, as a family. In the end, those conflicts, those disagreements made us stronger. Patrick Lencioni, an expert in organizational leadership, argues that the foundation of every healthy organization, including a church congregation, is trust. And trust will inevitably lead to honest, healthy, creative conflict. Because all people have differences of opinion. You see, absence of conflict is what happens among polite people who fear that their relationship can't survive a disagreement. Now, not every conflict makes you stronger, I know this. Some conflicts, especially those that occur between parties who do not love and trust each other, those conflicts, they have no creative element. They only destroy. So I'm not suggesting that we here at UUCJ should have a theological, no-holds-barred melee every week. But creative conflict is an earmark of beloved community. And if we do not give ourselves the opportunity to explore the vastness of our theological diversity, if we do not trust each other enough to be willing to share our personal beliefs with each other, if we lack the courage to disagree openly with one another, then we are condemning ourselves not to perpetual harmony, but to perpetual stagnation. A beloved community that celebrates diversity of thought and belief is grounded in trust and love and bonded by covenant. Earlier today, Thomas shared a mathematical equation with you, so I'm going to give you my mathematical equation right now. Diversity plus trust will always equal dialogue. But dialogue will always include disagreement, if it's real. Sometimes we UUs make the mistake of believing that simply because UUism, the larger faith, has no creed, that means that individual UUs are not allowed to hold or develop personal theological beliefs of their own, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Every individual UU is encouraged to engage in a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Unlike various fundamentalist religions, among UUs, the word doubt is not a four-letter word. And that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean we don't have our own cultural taboos. For many UU congregations, the four-letter word isn't doubt, it is certainty. I've visited UU churches where the congregation had created a culture with a de facto don't ask, don't tell policy related to personal theological beliefs. The personal certainties that many, if not all of us, hold in our hearts. These personal beliefs were not to be discussed during worship, not to be discussed during social hour, as far as I could tell. Polite conversation instead revolved around issues related to lowest common denominators. You know, probably, in my opinion, the most famous lowest common denominator in our UU world is the 7 principles. Yeah, look, I'm going to be honest. I personally have a bit of a love-hate relationship with the principles, if I can be honest. I question their utility sometimes. I question whether they have done more good or bad for our faith. Let's review them briefly. You can follow along on the back of your order of service if you like. So we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement of spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Phillip, you don't believe in the inherent worth and dignity of every person? What's wrong with you? It's not what I'm saying. I personally agree with the substance of all these principles, but that's kind of the problem. They're all so agreeable. Show these principles to any American of any religious persuasion, and I bet you he's going to nod his head and say, yep. See, just about everyone on earth, or at least the Western Hemisphere, I'll say, can agree with all of these principles, so they don't really serve to delineate UUs as a unique people. The delineation of unique groups and peoples begins occurring when you start interpreting the principles. Ah, there's the rub. Everyone can agree on the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but who or what is a person? You and me? A corporation? A fetus? The principles were adopted in 1985, over 20 years after the Unitarians and Universalists merged to form the UUA in 1961, almost 2,000 years after Unitarian and Universalist theologies were being explored by heretical Christian church fathers. So it's clear, the 7 principles do not define us as a people of faith, yet that is so often how they are used, or perhaps abused. Because so many UUs have difficulty explaining our faith to outsiders, many of us have used, myself included, many of us have used the 7 principles as a convenient crutch to quickly explain who we are, even though the principles aren't really equipped, nor were they ever designed to do so. I view the 7 principles as our lowest common denominator. And there is nothing wrong with that. I do not say that derisively in any way. The principles represent wonderful, aspirational ideals, but they represent the very bottom floor of our faith, not the highest spire, not the ceiling. And on this point, I echo concerns expressed by former UUA President Reverend Bill Sinkford. Note, if you will, some of the words that are not contained in our 7 principles. I'll give you a brief list. Love, faith, hope, grace, God, the divine, prayer, holy, sacred, sin, atonement, worship, salvation, redemption, sacrifice. Sense a little bit of nervousness with those words. Don't misunderstand me. I am not suggesting that any of these words should be added to the principles, except maybe love. That one kind of boggles the mind a bit. I don't understand why love isn't in there. But remember, the 7 principles, they are our base. They are our lowest common denominator. As such, they are primarily ethical ideas rather than theological ones. It would be nearly impossible for any UU congregation, let alone UUs across the entire association, to come to any kind of consensus on any of these aforementioned terms. I get that. So they don't really belong in the small corpus of text that makes up our lowest common denominator. But do these words represent important concepts? Whether we personally use or do not use these terms to describe our personal faith journeys, do these terms represent and raise questions that would be valuable for us, both as individuals and as a faith community, to struggle with? Is there a God? If so, what is his or her nature? If there is no God, what does that mean for all of us? What, if anything, is sin? Does our answer to that question have practical consequences for the way that we all choose to live our lives? What is atonement? And what is its relationship to related but distinct concepts such as forgiveness, mercy, and grace? What, if anything, makes something holy? Should the term salvation or redemption have any kind of meaning for UUs? If we avoid these terms, is it because many of us don't believe in a literal hell? Or is it because we think we are so good and noble that none of us will ever reach a point in our life where we need to be saved or redeemed either by ourselves or by someone else? These are the kinds of questions that I want to struggle with. And I don't want to struggle with them alone. I want to struggle over these questions with a group of people of diverse backgrounds, experiences, and beliefs, a group of people who have made a solemn promise, a covenant, to let loving relationships transcend issues, a group of people who have promised to celebrate, not just tolerate, but celebrate diversity in all its forms. These are the kinds of questions that a church is uniquely positioned to answer, or at least struggle with. These are the questions we need to ask, struggle with, and constantly revisit. These are the questions I want my own daughters to face and to struggle with. More than concrete answers, what I want, what I crave, is just an authentic conversation. It's not that the answers don't matter. It's just that I fear we lose a piece of our humanity when we stop asking and re-asking these questions. Like Scylla and Charybdis, the twin dangers we face on either side of us are, one, coming prematurely to some concrete answer to these questions that we forever enshrine as absolute, such that the questions and answers never need to be re-examined again, or two, simply throwing up our hands, claiming the struggle is too much for us, and resorting to living out a comfortable, unexamined life for the rest of our days. As a UU, I refuse to succumb to either temptation. Frankly, I would rather punch myself in the face than attend a church that never moves its focus beyond the lowest common denominator. That's just me. You see, the church of the lowest common denominator, it is the church that fears disagreement and conflict, even creative conflict. The church of the lowest common denominator cannot truly celebrate diversity. It can only play lip service to the idea as it creates a culture that assimilates and homogenizes everything that it cannot recognize as itself. The church of the lowest common denominator sees comfort as the highest calling, the ultimate good in the universe, and at the altar of comfort, the church of the lowest common denominator will sacrifice authenticity, growth, and the search for truth and meaning. Let us ask the hard questions. Let us share not only our doubts with each other, but our certainties as well. Let us push and challenge each other in love to live examined lives worthy of this faith. Let us truly celebrate the diversity within our midst. Let us ever be a faith of exploration. Let us ever be a faith of possibilities. Blessed be.